That was the Foreign Secretary. Let's just get an idea now of exactly how complex this operation might be. Ash Alexander Cooper is a former Joint Operational Commander of the British Armed Forces. We spoke to at the time of the extraction from Afghanistan. Let's compare and contrast if we can. Ash Alexander Cooper, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Martin.
What are the challenges the military planners have got to embrace?
A very dynamic and rapidly changing situation on the ground. You know, as James cleverly just said, you know, the situation with the ceasefire is by no means guaranteed, and therefore they will be going to do what they need to do with a number of contingency planning options up their sleeve, that if the situation does change, that they don't leave people stranded.
Now, what are the options open to them? Overland, you've got to get out of that capital city if you can, have you? Because none of the local airports or airstrips are usable, correct?
Yeah, and that's my understanding, that the international airport is essentially out of bounds, and therefore the airfield that has been selected and has already been used, I believe, this morning, at least the first flight out that is taking British evacuees, is north of the capital by about 30 kilometres or so. But the options are difficult because of the size of the country. You know, the closest land option sees people drive to Port Sudan, which is still 525 miles away. And, you know, if you've got small children or you're old or struggling, then that's a pretty, you know, challenging journey in and of itself before you would get to a ship that might help. The land crossing north to Egypt is even longer. So the air route or the air option is the fastest, but it is the least, not least viable, but it's the hardest in terms of capacity, because planes clearly can only take a few hundred people at a time, whereas a large road convoy could take more. So that's going to be the balance that the planners and the government are grappling with, is how to get as many people out as quickly as possible. Yeah. You know, without assuming, and I think we can't be complacent and assume that the ceasefire will hold. They'd have to front load this and get as many people out while there is relative calm.
OK, I'm just going to interrupt our conversation just to note the fact that Joe Biden is going to run again to be president of the USA, and I will come to that. He's released some interview material, which we'll come to in a second. But Ash Alexander Cooper, let me just stay with the situation in Sudan. Some kind of Hollywood-esque deployment of massive Chinook helicopters to swoop in, pick people up and take them to safety. Is that pure fantasy? Those assets are just not available?
Well, it's not really that they're not available, but it is fantasy in some ways, because the numbers of people that we're talking about that need to be extracted would just not fit on the numbers of helicopters we have. And, you know, you might get away with the first wave without being targeted, but, you know, that would only take a few hundred and you leave, therefore, thousands behind. The biggest challenge I see now, and the criticality of that challenge, is communication. You know, if you mentioned Afghanistan in the intro, that, you know, one of the biggest failings of that particular evacuation was not the military's fault at all. They were doing everything they could on the ground, the men and women acting very bravely in difficult circumstances. It was the lack of communication and the clarity of that communication, as well as the logistical nightmare of many people who were not entitled to be evacuated turning up. So I worry that even if communications do get through to the many Brits who are hoping to be evacuated, if that word spreads and rumours circulate in Khartoum that if you just turn up at this particular location, you might get a seat on a plane, then that could make it extremely difficult, both from a security perspective and as well as a logistical, you know, humanitarian perspective, to get the right people out and not leave people behind inadvertently.
And just the decision of who's... I mean, these things are always chaos, Ash, aren't they? However well you've planned them, somebody's going to turn up and say, well, can't this person come too? Or he's my cousin, he's eligible. And in that case, the service personnel at that absolutely critical point have some hideous decisions to make.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the government's been very clear that it's, you know, immediate family only. But, you know, if you had a couple of extra cousins or family members who were going to be on their own and at risk, you know, what would you do? I think many, you know, it's not unexpected that people will bring other people just hoping that there's a chance, but that just means that it puts at risk the seats for others as well, because it'll just take longer to process and try and filter people out, and it will get very tense, and people will be very upset, traumatized and frustrated if they can't get all of their family out, even if they are not entitled.
Thank you very much indeed for explaining the dilemmas facing everybody, and of course we wish the operational people well in their ambition to try and get people to safety. Ash Alexander Cooper, former Joint Operational Commander of the British Armed Forces, just speaking to us on LBC.